Think you know how medieval peasants survived winter? Think again. Their homes weren't just cold. They were actively fighting against the elements every single night. From shared beds with livestock to breathing techniques designed to prevent pneumonia, medieval winters were a brutal game of survival. These people didn't just bundle up. They employed strategies that would make modern survivalists blush. That charming image of a thatched cottage with smoke curling from the chimney? It's wrong. Peel back the fairy tale version and you're left with a structure that functioned more like a colander than a home. Medieval peasant houses weren't designed for comfort. They were porous, damp cages in a constant battle with the elements. The walls looked solid enough from a distance, but that was an illusion. Wattle and daub construction meant thin wooden frames packed with mud, straw, and whatever else was handy. Over time, the material shrank and cracked, leaving gaps you could fit your fingers through. On windy nights, snow didn't just pile up outside, it blew straight through the walls in fine gusts, dusting sleeping areas with powder. Morning often revealed intricate frost patterns creeping across interior surfaces, despite whatever meager heat the hearth managed to produce. Underfoot, the dirt floor contributed its own special kind of misery. Unlike modern foundations, these compacted earth floors absorbed moisture like sponges. Rainwater seeped upward through the ground, turning the lowest foot of air into a chill zone that never warmed. Families learned to keep all textiles and food storage at least waist-high to avoid the creeping damp. In heavy storms, water pooled in low spots, forcing occupants to rearrange their few belongings around emerging puddles. Roofs fared no better. Thatch required constant maintenance, as wind stripped away loose strands and birds pilfered material for nests. A well-maintained roof might last 7 years. Neglected ones leaked within months. During heavy snowfalls, the weight threatened to collapse the entire structure. Families would take turns propping up sagging rafters with whatever poles or tools they had, bracing against the ominous creaks overhead. Windows were just holes with shutters, seldom sealed properly. Even when closed, icy drafts sliced through the gaps with enough force to make candles gutter. Families pasted parchment over openings in winter, but this barely dulled the wind's bite. The smartest households hung animal skins over window spaces, less for privacy than for trapping a thin layer of insulating air. Every house developed its own microclimate of discomfort. Heat from the single hearth rose immediately to the rafters, leaving the sleeping area chilled. Smoke collected under the roof thatch, creating a greasy layer that actually helped waterproof the interior, one of the few accidental benefits of the terrible ventilation. Meanwhile, cold air pooled at floor level, meaning children and the elderly suffered most from chilled feet and legs. Structural weaknesses weren't just inconveniences, they directly threatened survival. Chronic dampness led to respiratory illnesses, while frigid drafts could cause fatal chills overnight. A family might wake to find their stored grain ruined by moisture, or their last hen dead from hypothermia. Constant repairs consumed precious daylight hours that could have been spent gathering food or firewood. The house wasn't a refuge, it was a project that demanded endless labor just to maintain minimal livability. Seasonal changes turned these flaws into crises. Autumn rains saturated the walls, ensuring they'd release dampness all winter. Spring thaws transformed floors into mud pits, while summer heat baked the daub until it cracked anew. The best-built peasant homes might last a generation with constant care. The worst collapsed within years. Survivors would scavenge materials from the wreckage to start again, replicating the same flawed designs because they knew no alternatives. These weren't homes designed by architects, but desperate adaptations shaped by poverty. Every feature reflected harsh priorities. Thick walls for structural stability rather than insulation, high ceilings to accommodate smoke instead of warmth retention, dirt floors, because proper flooring required unattainable resources. Peasants didn't inhabit their houses so much as wage daily trench warfare against them, deploying limited resources to shore up weaknesses before the next storm hit. And when night fell, the real test began. That crackling fire in medieval paintings? Complete fiction. Your hearth wasn't some cozy centerpiece. It was a thick cloud of smoke slowly strangling your family. Picture this. No chimney, just a hole in the roof that lets in as much cold as it lets out smoke. You're not gathering around for stories. You're crouching near the flames because it's that, or lose toes to frostbite, inhaling enough soot to cough up charcoal by morning. Chimneys didn't become common until the 1200s, and even then, most peasants couldn't afford them. So the smoke pooled at shoulder height, creating distinct layers like some toxic atmosphere. Kids got the worst of it, their faces right in the soot zone as they slept. Researchers find skeletons from the period with blackened lung tissue, ribs fused from chronic inflammation. 5-year-olds developed hearth cough, a hacking wheeze that followed them into adulthood. That romantic firelight glow, it came with guaranteed emphysema. The placement of everything in the house revolved around smoke management. Beds went in the sweet spot, low enough to avoid the worst fumes but high enough to catch rising warmth. Grandparents often took the death zone near the roof hole, trading longer exposure for first crack at incoming sunlight. You'd think the fire's heat would help, but it mostly just delayed the inevitable. Frost still crept in from the walls overnight, turning breath vapor into ice crystals on your blanket. Keeping the fire alive wasn't optional. Let it die, and the temperature would plummet fast enough to freeze stored grain. Villages maintained a nightly ember exchange system, borrowing coals from neighbors if yours sputtered out. But constant tending meant constant smoke. Seasonal respiratory infections weren't an inconvenience. They were expected, like winter itself. Surviving to spring meant accepting that every lungful of warmth carried a price. The real kicker? Those who couldn't take the smoke had no alternatives. No electric blankets, no double-paned windows, just the choice between suffocation or hypothermia. Wealthy households had the same problem, just with fancier hangings to absorb the grime. Castle halls were so smoky that servants developed minstrel's throat from singing through permanent irritation. Even the nobility couldn't buy their way out of medieval air quality. And forget leaving the fire unattended. Banking the coals wrong could mean waking to a house full of lethal carbon monoxide. Some families slept in shifts to tend the flames, passing the tending duty like a baton in some awful relay race against the cold. The fire didn't care if you were exhausted. It demanded attention the way a drowning man demands oxygen desperately, mortally. By February, everyone's eyes were permanently bloodshot from smoke irritation. Clothes smelled like wood smoke for generations. Modern reenactors can't replicate that all-consuming stench without making themselves sick. Your whole existence revolved around that fragile heat source, measuring life expectancy in remaining log piles. Churches kept emergency fuel stashes because even holy spaces weren't exempt. In hindsight, the miracle isn't that medieval lifespans were short. It's that anyone survived winters at all, breathing that air while fighting off malnutrition and damp. Modern reconstructions show carbon monoxide levels in these homes regularly hit factory safety violation thresholds. That fireplace in your favorite medieval drama? It's a lie. Real fires didn't warm rooms, they created survivable pockets in an ocean of cold, sold at the cost of lung tissue. That warm body next to you isn't your spouse, it's Buttercup the goat, and she gets the spot nearest the hearth. Medieval peasants didn't have the luxury of separate sleeping quarters. Homes were single-room survival pods where humans and animals huddled together purely for thermodynamics. Forget privacy, every sleeping arrangement was dictated by heat retention physics. The strongest family member slept closest to the door, not out of some chivalrous duty, but because that was the most miserable post. Doorways leaked icy drafts all night, so they needed someone whose body could block the worst of it. Children and the elderly got the premium spots near the hearth, where animal body heat pooled. You didn't earn your sleeping position through seniority, but through how efficiently you could function as living insulation. Straw mattresses were less bedding than ecosystem hubs. Fleas bred in the dried stalks, lice migrated between warm bodies, and mice nested in the corners. Goats and chickens wandered freely, sometimes burrowing into the straw for warmth. Historical records mention hens laying eggs overnight right beside sleepers' free breakfast if you didn't roll over and crush it by mistake. People woke up with livestock stepping over them, searching for warmer patches. The smell alone would knock a modern person unconscious. Unwashed humans, wet wool, animal dung, smoky thatch, it all mixed into a thick fug that hung chest high. But peasants didn't notice. Olfactory fatigue set in by adolescence. What did register was temperature. A cow's body radiated heat at 101 Dufour F, making it the most coveted bedmate. Pigs were second-tier warmer than goats, but more likely to steal your blanket. Sleeping positions followed strict protocols. Families curled like spoons to minimize exposed surface area, often layered under the same massive cloak. Removing outer clothes was unthinkable. Boots stayed laced, hoods pulled tight. Some households rigged rope frames over beds to hang additional cloaks as makeshift canopies, trapping breath warmth near the faces of toddlers. Every exhale was a tiny furnace worth conserving. Nighttime was an endless game of thermal musical chairs. As the fire died down, cold spots shifted. Someone wise had to get up and rearrange bodies, pulling grandma closer to the sheep, sliding children toward the cooling hearthstones. The sick got prioritized for animal contact, their feverish bodies making them dual-purpose heat sources. Privacy wasn't just irrelevant, it was actively dangerous. Isolation meant hypothermia. Animals weren't just passive warmers, they were alarm systems. A restless goat might signal that the hearth embers were fading to danger levels. Chickens clucked when drafts kicked up under the door. Dogs earned their keep by lying across doorway thresholds as living draft stoppers. Every creature in that room had a thermoregulatory job, right down to the cats that hunted the mice who nibbled insulation materials. The bed itself was a science experiment. The wealthy had feather mattresses, but peasants made do with sacks of straw over wooden planks. Over months, the straw compacted into lumps while absorbing sweat, grease, and spills. By spring, a mattress might weigh 40 pounds with moisture. Some households flipped them seasonally. The drier top layer faced up in summer. The more compacted and insulating bottom layer turned upward come winter. Shared sleeping had brutal downsides beyond smell. Turning over required group coordination. One sudden move dumped cold air under the shared covers. Nighttime coughs spread tuberculosis like wildfire. And heaven help you if an animal panicked. There are records of peasants crushed by spooked livestock in confined spaces. But the alternative, sleeping alone, meant risking death by exposure. When temperatures plunged, the scrawniest chicken in the room suddenly became your MVP. Winters reshaped social norms around sleep. Couples didn't sleep entwined. They slept back to back to maximize shared body heat. Visitors were welcomed into the pile, no questions asked. Traveling monks wrote of being ushered into peasant homes at dusk and waking with a child's foot in their face and a pig against their back. Personal space was a summertime luxury. The morning aftermath looked like a battlefield. Stray feathers, trampled herbs spread to deter lice, animal droppings from nocturnal wanderings. Yet that chaos represented victory. Another night survived. While modern campers brag about roughing it in sleeping bags, peasants spent months annually enduring conditions that would make survival experts quit. And they did it wearing the same lice-ridden woolens night after night, with a barnyard's worth of companions. Privacy didn't vanish in medieval winters. It was exposed as the pointless modern affectation it truly is when stacked against survival. And their bedding choices were equally pragmatic. You know that greasy feeling when you haven't showered in days? For medieval peasants, that was winter armor. Modern hygiene would have killed them faster than any plague. Their layers of dirt weren't negligence, they were sophisticated climate control. Wool tunics absorbed body oils, sweat, and environmental grime until the fibers swelled shut. What started as loosely woven cloth became nearly windproof after weeks without washing. Dirt particles filled microscopic gaps better than any medieval loom could weave. The same principle applied to foot wraps, linen strips worn instead of socks that gained cushioning from accumulated filth. Washed too often, and they'd lose their insulating properties. The smell was functional. That ripe body odor signaled a well-developed layer of protective bacteria. Skin oils built up into a waxy barrier against windburn. Peasants, rubbing dirt into their hands, weren't being filthy, they were creating makeshift gloves. In freezing temperatures, slightly muddy skin resisted chapping better than scrubbed clean surfaces. Even hair was left unwashed for months, the natural oils preventing frostbite on ears and necks. Bed sheets exemplify the system. What we'd consider unbearably dirty was a carefully maintained microenvironment. Fleas and lice were inevitable, but their populations were somewhat controlled by layers of crushed herbs beneath the straw. The real magic happened in the bedding's accumulated sweat and skin cells, a fermented mix that actually raised the warmth retention of wool blankets. Shake out a peasant's bedding, and you'd lose months of carefully cultivated insulation. Layered clothing followed similar rules. Undergarments were seldom removed, their inner surfaces developing a patina of oils that repelled moisture. Outer layers, like hooded cloaks, had deliberately greasy hems where hands constantly wiped themselves. This grimy edge provided crucial wind resistance around the face during blizzards. Wealthy folks who could afford frequent laundering actually suffered more from cold-related ailments until they adopted peasant hygiene habits during harsh winters. The microbial aspect was crucial. Modern experiments show unwashed wool hosts beneficial bacteria that inhibit mold growth vital when everything was perpetually damp. Peasant skin microbe iomes adapted to their limited washing, maintaining protective flora that modern antibacterial soap would strip away. Church records note that during famines, the perpetually dirty poor sometimes outlasted cleaner townsfolk, possibly because their immune systems were constantly engaged. Children were initiated early. Toddlers wore the same linens for weeks while their skin adapted. By adolescence, their bodies produced extra sebum during cold months, a seasonal adaptation modern hygiene has bred out of us. Elders' distinctive old person smell was prized. Their long-developed bacterial ecosystems made them invaluable bed warmers during cold snaps. Food storage benefited from controlled filth. Cheese and bread kept longer when stored in the greasy folds of seldom-washed aprons. Some households hung sausages near the hearth, not just to smoke them, but to coat them in that protective layer of airborne grease and soot. Even drinking vessels gained insulation value from unwashed interiors. The residue of fermented beverages created a slight thermal barrier against the cold. The system had brutal downsides. Skin infections were constant, especially around areas where damp cloth chafed. Lice carried diseases beyond just discomfort. But the alternative, frequent washing in icy water, could be literally deadly. Many parish death records list washing as a contributing factor for winter fatalities, usually involving elderly folks who caught chills after rare baths. Maintaining the right level of grime was an art. Too little and you'd freeze. Too much and you'd attract rodents or infection. Experienced housewives knew exactly when to shake out bedding or rinse clothing without stripping all the valuable oils. Some villages employed dirt women who collected and redistributed desirable household grime. The greasy buildup behind ale barrels was particularly prized for boot waterproofing. Modern recreations fail to capture this deliberately maintained filth. Reenactors who try living medieval style often give up when their obsessive cleaning leaves them freezing. Archaeologists find linen fragments with built-up oils. We can't replicate because our bodies don't produce sebum the same way without years of training. That bacon-esque smell of an unwashed wool tunic? A complex survival mechanism we've lost to history. What registers as disgusting today was once cutting-edge survival tech. Those dark streaks on medieval manuscript illustrations weren't artistic license. They documented clothing darkened by years of accumulated body oils and smoke. When Chaucer's pilgrims complained about each other's stench, they were really noting who had the best winter insulation. Cleanliness didn't correlate to godliness. It correlated to frozen corpses. Come February, which made their cooking methods equally unappetizing. Take a deep breath right now. Your medieval counterpart would have slapped your wrists for doing it wrong. Modern breathing exercises aim for relaxation, but in the Middle Ages, proper respiration was a survival skill. One uncontrolled mouth breath in January could mean pneumonia by week's end. Medieval parents trained children from toddlerhood to breathe through their noses year-round. The nasal passages warm incoming air by up to 20 degrees before it hits delicate lung tissue. Kids learned to cover their mouths with wool-wrapped hands when coughing wasn't optional. Those colorful scarves in medieval illustrations? They weren't fashion, they were particulate filters, trapping debris before it could enter airways. Night breathing presented unique dangers. Exhaled too close to damp bedding, and your own breath created condensation that refroze into ice crystals near your face. Families sleeping head to toe weren't being modest. They were spacing themselves to prevent shared breath vapor from soaking communal blankets. The elderly slept slightly propped up because lying flat allowed cold air to pool in their bronchial tubes. Respiratory discipline extended to speech. Villagers developed a habit of speaking slowly in winter, reducing how much frigid air they inhaled during conversations. Chatty children were scolded not for noise, but for wasting body heat. Court records show bakers could demand higher prices in winter because their jobs required constant talking with customers, which meant breathing more cold air. The humidity of exhaled air became a resource. Some households hung linen strips near sleepers' faces to catch moisture, which they'd wring out into drinking cups come morning. Thirsty survivors of the Great Famine reportedly licked frost from their own breath, condensed on scarves. Every function of the body was co-opted for survival. Improper breathing left forensic evidence. Parish burial records list winter lungs as a common cause of death, what modern doctors would diagnose as acute respiratory distress syndrome. Autopsies on alpine ice mummies reveal lung tissue darkened not just by smoke inhalation, but by repeated frost damage from cold air exposure. Some show healed fissures where bronchial tubes had literally frozen and cracked during previous winters. Wealth offered little protection. Nobles in drafty castles suffered stone lung from breathing damp, cold air in vaulted chambers. Monastic rules required silent meals partly to minimize cold air intake while eating. Even the king's physicians advised breathing through wine-soaked cloths during winter travels, an early attempt at air warming. The poorest developed accidental advantages. Those living in smoke-filled houses had lung cilia paralyzed by soot, which ironically reduced frost damage from cold air. Peasants with chronic coughs often survived extreme cold spells better than healthy townsfolk because their inflamed bronchial tubes restricted freezing air intake. Some village wise women actually prescribed light smoking to teenage boys heading into winter fieldwork. Foreign travelers struggled to adapt. Mediterranean merchants wintering in England complained of breath fever, their unprepared lungs reacting violently to cold air. Russian traders, accustomed to deeper cold, mocked Londoners for wrapping scarves over noses in what they saw as mild weather. Breathing techniques were as regional as dialects. Modern recreations prove the effectiveness. Historical interpreters report noticeable differences when testing medieval breathing methods in authentic conditions. Nose breathing reduces throat irritation within hours. Wool face wraps cut coughing fits significantly. Yet participants consistently forget during sleep, waking with sore throats from mouth breathing, precisely the danger medieval parents guarded against. The system had brutal limits. Those with nasal deformities or chronic congestion faced higher winter mortality. Court records mention mouth breathers as a vulnerable population. Spring thaws brought waves of respiratory deaths as weakened lungs succumbed to suddenly moist air. Some herbal remedies, like horehound tea, worked by suppressing cough reflexes that wasted body heat, not by curing underlying conditions. Children's games reinforced proper technique. Breath-holding contests strengthened diaphragm control. Snow Ghosts, a game where kids competed to see whose exhalations showed most in cold air, taught vapor control. Teens practiced speaking clearly through layered scarves to prepare for messenger work. Every aspect of childhood groomed survival reflexes we've since abandoned. What medieval people lacked in medical knowledge, they compensated for through brutal trial and error. They didn't understand alveoli or bronchioles, but they knew exactly how morning frost on a sick man's beard predicted his chances of seeing Easter. Modern medicine calls it respiratory physiology. They called it not dying before breakfast. all while eating foods designed as internal furnaces. That thick slab of bread wasn't just food, it was your central heating system. Medieval winter cuisine operated on one brutal principle: digestion equals warmth. Every meal was engineered to stoke the body's furnace as slowly and inefficiently as possible. Forget balanced diets, survival meant maximizing calories that burned for hours like poorly banked coals. Peasant bread was dense by design. Bakers intentionally undercooked loaves, leaving the centers doughy. This heavy mass took longer to digest, extending warmth production. Some village ovens ran all night just to produce this inadequate but thermally effective bread. What we'd consider failed baking was actually precision, engineering the equivalent of stuffing your gut with time-release heat packets. Stews weren't seasoned for taste, but for thermodynamics. Floating chunks of fat cooled slower than meat, creating pockets of residual warmth in the stomach. Herbs weren't flavor enhancers. They were digestive irritants that slightly raised body temperature. Pepper was worth its weight in silver not for taste, but because it made you sweat internally during the coldest nights. Fat preservation methods bordered on grotesque. Butter was packed into barrels and submerged in peat bogs, where anaerobic conditions preserved it for years while adding a rancid tang. By midwinter, this fermented butter contained enough bacteria to induce mild fever, an accidental side effect peasants welcomed for its warming properties. Cheese wheels developed mold intentionally, their blue veins producing metabolic heat as they broke down proteins. The wealthy suffered from their cleaner diets. Nobles eating lean meats and refined grains actually chilled faster than fat-gorging peasants. Some manorial records show lords secretly purchasing peasant butter during cold snaps, despite considering it unfit for regular consumption. A well-marbled serf could outlast his lord simply by metabolizing his own fat reserves more efficiently. Food storage doubled as thermal regulation. Root vegetables were kept in bedrooms rather than cellars. Their respiration released tiny amounts of heat. Apples dotted sleeping areas like nature's hand warmers, their gradual decay warming the immediate air. One shrewd tactic involved storing grain sacks against exterior walls where they'd absorb incoming cold before it reached people. Feasting cycles followed temperature drops. Villages timed celebrations around weather forecasts they didn't fully understand. A hard freeze meant sudden pork slaughter, not because the meat wouldn't keep, but because digesting rich protein raised metabolic rates. Church fasting rules bent in winter, when priests recognized starvation made congregations freeze to death in pews. Beverage choices followed thermal logic. Small beer wasn't just safer than water, its alcohol dilated blood vessels near the skin, creating false warmth that prevented careless frostbite. Spiced wines were medicinal. Cloves and cinnamon triggered thermogenesis. Even wealthy households drank warm beer in winter, while saving fine vintages for summer when cooling beverages were preferred. Children's diets were ruthlessly optimized. Nursing mothers ate extra fats to increase milk's caloric density. Toddlers received pre-chewed meat not for digestion, but because saliva started breaking down proteins before ingestion, speeding calorie absorption. Some villages maintained warm milk grandmothers, elderly women who consumed extra fats solely to produce high-energy breast milk for orphaned infants. Food preparation wasted nothing, especially heat. Ovens stayed operational for days, with neighbors collaborating on baking schedules. The residual warmth from bread ovens cooked secondary dishes like porridges. One-pot meals simmered for weeks, constantly replenished, like a culinary version of perpetual flame. Women tucked hot stones from hearths into dough mix to jumpstart, rising in cold kitchens. Starvation wasn't just hunger, it was hypothermia waiting to happen. Records from famine winters describe victims dying warmer than expected because their bodies burned muscle tissue for emergency heat. Some survivors intentionally underate during daylight to save calories for nighttime warmth production. Monasteries developed fasting bread with hidden nut pastes so monks could technically observe fasts while staying warm. Modern dieting would have been suicide. Those extra pounds we fret over meant survival reserves. Plump teens were marriageable assets. Skinny laborers froze in fields. Body fat distribution became a life-saving adaptation. Peasant women's famous apron bellies protected reproductive organs from frost damage. What medicine now calls obesity was then an evolutionary advantage. Eating habits followed the sun. Largest meals came at dusk to fuel overnight warmth. Leftovers were breakfast cold meals, didn't waste precious firewood on reheating. Field workers carried frozen stew blocks in their belts. Body heat thawed them by midday. Some families shared single spoons, not from poverty, but to slow consumption and prolong digestion's warming effects. The system had brutal limits. Vitamin deficiencies ran rampant even as bellies stayed full. Scurvy-ridden gums bled onto energy-dense cheeses. Children developed rickets from missing sunlight while gorging on insulating fats. But in the calculus of survival, frostbite killed faster than malnutrition. Every meal was a strategic decision weighing immediate warmth against long-term health. When harsh winters hit, cooking methods grew desperate. Grain stores ran low, forcing bakers to mix in ground bark or dried peas, substances that wreaked havoc on digestion but generated internal heat through irritation. Some village records mention famine bread containing wool fibers for bulk, which at least provided warmth on the way through the system. We've lost this visceral connection between food and warmth. Modern heating renders calorie-dense winter foods optional rather than vital. Those medieval recipes we recreate as quaint curiosities were actually thermal engineering schematics. That sticking to your ribs feeling wasn't metaphorical. It was your body preparing to wage war against the cold for another night. And when the fire went out, neighbors became crucial. Your neighbor's hearth wasn't just for cooking. It was your emergency heating backup when your own fire sputtered out. Medieval villages didn't have ambulances or emergency shelters. They had teenage runners ready to dash through blizzards with ember-filled pots, because one household's extinguished fire endangered the entire community. Village councils appointed heat watchers each winter, typically older children who moved between homes checking hearth temperatures. Their job wasn't snooping. It was preventing entire families from freezing overnight. If your fire dipped below safe levels, they'd whistle through cupped hands, signaling neighbors to prepare spare coals. Some parishes kept communal ember banks, clay pots buried in warm ashes, where households could withdraw preserved coals during crises. Isolation was a death sentence. Remote farmsteads faced grim choices during deep freezes, either trek through deadly storms to reach help or gamble on surviving alone. Records show some families burned furniture before resorting to the journey, knowing the road might claim more lives than the cold. Villages closer to manors fared better. Feudal lords maintained heated outbuildings for emergencies, though using them often meant extra harvest duties come spring. The elderly became thermometers. Communities tracked seniors' complaints about the cold more accurately than weather patterns. When Grandma started shivering despite extra blankets, everyone knew a dangerous chill was coming. Some villages positioned oldest members nearest church braziers during services, not just for comfort, but because their early discomfort warned others to bolster home defenses. Child swapping was common. Families with infants would send older children to neighbors overnight during coldest snaps. This distributed body heat more efficiently. Babies stayed cocooned with parents while sturdier kids piled into houses needing extra warmth. Church registers sometimes list bizarre lodging debts, where families owed each other child nights of thermal assistance. Firewood was communal property in crisis. Strict rules governed who could forage, what during storms deadfall went to families with newborns first, then the elderly. Stealing another household's carefully stacked wood wasn't just theft, it was potentially mass murder. Some villages employed wood wardens to patrol stores during long winters, their axes ready to enforce fair distribution. The sick triggered village-wide responses. One case of frostbite meant everyone checked their hearths. 2 fever cases and spare blankets were redistributed. 3 coughing families signaled time to slaughter livestock for emergency tallow production. Communities couldn't afford to wait by the time obvious suffering appeared. it was often too late to prevent cascading deaths. Night watch systems arose organically. Adults took turns staying awake to tend multiple hearths along their street. Wealthy households participated too. Their servants often managed the neighborhood fire watch. Some developed complex tapping codes using pokers against andirons. 2 clinks meant, "Your chimney's smoking wrong." 3 meant, "Send embers." Animals became early warning systems. Villagers noticed livestock huddling patterns predicted cold snaps better than weather lore. A sudden pileup of sheep against barn walls signaled impending danger. Dogs were brought indoors not for companionship, but because their whining at temperature drops woke sleepers before hypothermia set in. Church bells served practical purposes. Besides marking time, their ringing sequences communicated emergencies. A rapid peal meant someone's roof had collapsed under snow. Some parishes kept bells muffled in deep cold since the sound could trigger avalanches, opting instead for horn signals carried between houses. The wealthy weren't exempt. Manorial records show lords diverting castle fuel stores to villages during worst winters, not from kindness, but because dead peasants couldn't work fields. Nobles visiting frozen estates wrote of being mobbed by tenants, demanding access to their glasshouses, where citrus trees grew in artificial warmth. Winter weddings increased survival odds. Couples often married in autumn to consolidate households before cold weather. A joined family meant doubled firewood stores and shared body heat. Some villages suspended normal marriage negotiations during harsh winters, pairing off singles by proximity rather than dowries. Death required immediate action. Frozen corpses couldn't be buried in solid ground. So villages maintained waiting sheds lined with insulating straw where bodies were stored until spring. These grim structures often doubled as emergency shelters. Living and dead sharing space was preferable to freezing. Modern emergency protocols seem sterile by comparison. Medieval villages didn't have disaster response teams. They had every able-bodied person functioning as both victim and rescuer simultaneously. Your neighbor's cough was your problem because next week you might need their embers. That layer of grime insulating their skin? You'd inherit its microbiome if they died, and you took in their orphans. Survival math was brutally simple. 10 households pooling resources could outlast a storm that would kill each alone. Some village charters explicitly prohibited constructing new homes beyond whistle distance of others. Solitude wasn't just lonely, it was mathematically unsustainable. These networks weren't about friendship but thermodynamics. Personal conflicts were set aside from November to April. You'd share blankets with the man who stole your harvest wages if it meant surviving the night. Modern social media connects people superficially. Medieval villages interlinked nervous systems like some sprawling, hibernating organism. When the last log burned out and the frost crept through the walls, medieval peasants didn't just shiver, they invoked Saint Blaise. This patron saint of throat ailments got more winter overtime than a modern emergency room doctor. Every prayer, charm, and candle wasn't just spiritual comfort. It was another layer of thermal defense in a world where faith counted as preventive medicine. Churches supplied blessed candles with precise instructions, placed near the bed's northeast corner to block death, bringing drafts. People didn't just cross themselves before sleep. They made the sign of the cross over drafty cracks in walls, tracing invisible insulation. The wealthy embedded relics in their homes' foundation stones, not for prestige, but because saints' bones allegedly radiated warmth. Bioarchaeologists find medieval skeletons buried with scorched fingertips from endlessly relighting devotional candles during winter vigils. Holy water did double duty. Splashed across doorways, it supposedly created spiritual barriers against cold winds. More practically, the salt content lowered water's freezing point, making icy patches less lethal. Some villages compounded winter holy water with extra salt, a heresy everyone quietly tolerated. Miracle stories often featured candles that burned unnaturally long during blizzards, which chemists now suggest resulted from tallow mixed with wax from weather-resistant bees. The line between prayer and practical remedy blurred completely. Winter psalms were recited in specific sequences believed to raise body temperature. Monastic records describe monks chanting while performing slow calisthenics to combine spiritual and physical warmth generation. Families hung dried vervain and other herbs not just as charms, but because their slow combustion released mild heat when added to embers. Saint statues got winter modifications. Parishioners swaddled holy figures in extra vestments during cold snaps, partly as devotion, partly to guilt-trip the divine into providing warmth. Some villages practiced mitre rotations, moving bishop saints' statues to different homes weekly so their perceived blessings and accompanying donated fuel circulated fairly. The church officially frowned on this, but couldn't stop it during harsh winters. Death rituals adapted to the cold. Corpses were covered in heated shrouds to maintain the illusion of warmth until burial, delaying rigor mortis for viewings. Gravediggers attested that earth resisted freezing longer around consecrated ground, a phenomenon modern researchers attribute to decomposed organic matter lowering soil's freezing point. For peasants, it was proof of divine intervention. Calendar customs reinforced survival tactics. Candlemas on February 20 wasn't just a feast day, it marked when households assessed their remaining winter fuel and adjusted rationing. The timing of St. Lucy's Day festivities coincided with the toughest stretch of early winter darkness, her crown of candles offering a practical light source during the year's longest nights. Miracles reflected environmental needs. Numerous saints were credited with causing mystery melts, sudden thaws that saved freezing communities. Climate historians now link these to natural Chinook winds, but medieval peasants saw divine mercy. Conversely, unexpected freezes were interpreted as punishments, motivating communities to shore up their physical and spiritual defenses simultaneously. The psychological benefits were measurable. Chroniclers note that deeply religious households survived extreme winters at higher rates, not because God favored them, but because their rituals maintained strict routines of fire-tending, body-warming exercises, and communal checks. Herbal remedies administered with prayer likely benefited from the placebo effect during times when real medicine was useless against cold. Every spiritual act had thermal consequences. Rosary beads kept fingers moving to prevent frostbite. Midnight masses forced attendees to walk vigorously through cold streets, maintaining circulation. Even confession served a purpose. The physical act of kneeling on cold chapel floors may have helped acclimate bodies to low temperatures before sleep. The church capitalized on this pragmatism. Friars sold winter indulgences, promising shorter purgatory stays in exchange for donating firewood to the poor. Monastery infirmaries treated frostbite with prayers and warm compresses, achieving better outcomes than secular healers through simple thermodynamics. Some convents developed thriving businesses selling beeswax candles impregnated with menthol, effectively creating medieval Vicks vapor rub. Peasants weren't naive. They knew which practices worked regardless of theology. A charm that included rubbing garlic on the soles of feet, real circulation booster, might also include nonsense Latin phrases, but both got used. Survival trumps doctrinal purity. Families who'd survived bad winters often kept eclectic shrines, mixing Christian icons with pre-Christian symbols, hedging their bets. Modern recreations reveal unexpected benefits. Historical interpreters note that following medieval prayer schedules with vigorous genuflections every few hours actually maintains core body temperature better than sedentary modern routines. The rhythmic breathing during Ave Marias mimics modern cold weather respiration techniques. Even the fear of divine punishment may have kept people more vigilant about fire maintenance. The system's dark side emerged during extreme winters. When entire villages froze despite prayers, survivors often turned on alleged sinners as scapegoats. Some witch trial records mention accusations of frost magic, where lone women were blamed for unseasonable cold. Others showed desperate people violating church laws by sleeping in consecrated buildings for warmth, risking excommunication just to survive. By spring, the spiritual balance sheet became clear. Parishes that weathered winter with few deaths saw increased piety. Those devastated by cold often experienced religious crises. Some villages permanently abandoned certain saints who'd failed them during harsh winters, chiseling names off altars. Faith wasn't just belief, it was a contractual agreement where survival equaled divine favor. The winter of 1315 didn't just make life difficult, it erased entire communities from existence. While modern climate change feels unprecedented, medieval Europe weathered storms that reduced populations by half in some regions. The Great Famine's winters represent what happens when every survival tactic fails simultaneously, when bark becomes a luxury food and frozen ground refuses graves. Contemporary chronicles describe villages where doorways filled with drifted snow overnight, sealing families inside their own homes. Spring revealed cottages with frozen corpses still hunched over dead hearths, their last sticks of furniture burned to ash. Monks reported farmers gnawing on thatch pulled from their roofs. When stored grain ran out, the scratchy fibers providing minimal nutrition but something to occupy starving stomachs. Records from the worst years show unsettling patterns. Churches logged baptisms dropping sharply as women stopped ovulating from malnutrition. Tax collectors visited settlements only to find empty houses with frost-heaved floorboards. Their former occupants vanished into the woods. Some villages maintained strangers' hearths, communal fire pits where travelers found skeletal remains huddled around cold stones. The physical evidence tells its own story. Mass graves from these winters contain bones with telltale gnaw marks, not from animals, but from human teeth. Leather artifacts disappear from archaeological layers as footwear became emergency rations. Ice core samples show atmospheric pollution dropped during these years because so few fires burned across the continent. Survivors faced impossible choices. Some parish records list families selling children to wealthier households, not as servants, but as extra bodies to share warmth. Courts waived punishment for wood theft during extreme winters, recognizing desperation trumped law. Landowners wrote panicked letters about tenants abandoning farms to seek shelter in already packed towns, where plague would later finish what cold started. Animals suffered equally. Farmers reported livestock freezing mid-graze, their tongues stuck to icy pastures. Wolves grew bold enough to snatch babies from hearthsides as parents weakened. Some villages sacrificed prized oxen not for meat, but to pack body cavities with warm organs as primitive heating pads for infants. The psychological toll reshaped cultures. Folktales from this period feature relentless winter spirits requiring human sacrifices, likely echoes of real-life decisions to abandon the elderly. Superstitions about hunger ghosts persisted for centuries, born from memories of neighbors dying with frostbitten fingers stuffed in their mouths for warmth. Even the wealthy weren't immune. Noble households reported eating their hunting dogs when supply lines froze. Geology conspired against survivors. Some regions experienced frostquakes as freezing groundwater fractured bedrock, the explosions mistaken for divine wrath. Rivers froze so thickly that spring melts caused catastrophic flooding, washing away topsoil needed for recovery planting. Coastal areas fared worst as frozen oceans couldn't provide emergency fish supplies. The church's response reveals the scale of despair. Some bishops authorized eating horse meat despite religious prohibitions. Monasteries melted down sacred vessels to buy grain, only to find none available at any price. A few desperate clerics even encouraged suicide pacts among the elderly to conserve resources for children, a heresy later scrubbed from official records. Recovery took generations. Surviving account books show fields lying fallow for decades as labor pools vanished. The price of wool skyrocketed not from demand, but because so few sheep survived to shear. Some villages never rebounded. Modern aerial surveys reveal faint crop marks where entire communities once stood, reclaimed by forests after their last inhabitant froze. Hardest hit were the young. Skeletal remains from mass graves show stunted growth patterns where children's bodies prioritized keeping vital organs warm over limb development. Those who survived often bore lifelong disabilities from frostbite or malnutrition. Genealogists note family names disappearing not from plague but from reproductive collapse during these winters. The economic shocks lasted centuries. Depopulation forced wage increases for surviving workers, destabilizing feudal systems. Abandoned farmland reverted to wilderness, creating hunting grounds for kings but starvation for former tillers. Even the climate bore scars. Some scholars believe the catastrophic tree die-offs contributed to the Little Ice Age. What made these winters apocalyptic wasn't just cold, but duration. The Great Famine's misery stretched over 3 relentless years, each worse than the last. Unlike modern disasters with emergency responses, medieval societies had no reserves left by the second winter. Eating seed grain meant no harvest. Burning roof beams traded immediate warmth for future shelter. Archaeologists uncovered one chilling tableau in the Alps, a shepherd's hut where the occupant had systematically dismantled his own dwelling for fuel. The final layers were his leather garments and boots, burned before he succumbed beside a hearth of melted snow. His bones showed no signs of violence, just the wasting effects of prolonged cold exposure. These weren't winters as we understand them. They were cascading failures of every survival system. Villages that withstood Viking raids and plague outbreaks met their end in silent whiteouts that left no witnesses. Parish registers switched from parchment to birch bark as supplies ran low, the frozen scribbles documenting disappearances rather than deaths. Some disappearances defy explanation. Coastal towns recorded fishing boats found drifting with frozen crews, their nets full of fish that arrived too late. Inland, patrols discovered entire families clustered around empty larders, their faces oddly peaceful despite obvious starvation. The very mechanisms that normally preserved life, clustering for warmth, conserving energy, became death traps in endless winter. What chills most isn't the grim details, but how close these events sit in our timeline. The Great Famine ended just 7 generations before Columbus sailed. Many European ancestors alive today carry trauma responses coded into their DNA from survivors who ate leather and buried siblings in snowbanks. Our modern climate anxiety isn't just about the future, it's genetic memory of winters that nearly broke humanity. That Home Depot run you did last weekend? Medieval peasants would laugh at your flimsy repair skills. Their houses weren't buildings you maintained. They were crumbling jigsaw puzzles, held together with whatever disgusting materials happened to be handy. A modern contractor would take one look at a medieval cottage and call the building inspectors. Every repair was an emergency patch job. Wattle and daub walls constantly cracked as the materials dried and shifted. Instead of proper mortar, peasants stuffed gaps with whatever they could find: moss stolen from church roofs, cow dung mixed with straw, even clumps of human hair saved from haircuts. Some households kept patch kits containing hedgehog skins for plugging holes. The quills helped anchor them in crumbling walls. Roofs were worse. Thatched roofs leaked within months as birds stole material and wind tore loose strands away. Rather than rethatch properly, which required entire villages working together, most families did quick fixes, tossing hay bales on top as temporary coverage, or soaking the surface with water to make it freeze into a brittle shell. Some archaeological finds show roofs repaired with stolen road signs or discarded armor pieces when proper materials ran out. Floors required constant attention. Dirt floors compacted unevenly, creating puddles whenever it rained. Families spread layers of crushed oyster shells, ash, or even animal bones to improve drainage. In winter, they'd lay down fresh rushes every few weeks just to have something between their feet and the freezing ground. The rushes weren't thrown away. When soiled, they got swept into corners to dry and reuse, creating permanent musty piles that attracted vermin. Doors and windows barely functioned. Hinges were usually just leather straps that stretched and cracked in cold weather. Frost-heaved door frames stuck shut until someone kicked them loose. Window coverings consisted of oiled parchment that needed replacing monthly as it yellowed and peeled. Wealthier peasants might nail a thin slice of horn over openings not for visibility, but because it let in dim light without the draft of an open shutter. Structural sag was inevitable. Without proper foundations, houses slowly listed to one side as the ground froze and thawed beneath them. Families would prop up drooping beams with scavenged ship masts or even inverted plows. Some cottages developed such dramatic leans that sleepers had to brace themselves uphill to avoid rolling out of bed. Adjustable furniture legs weren't a style choice, they compensated for floors that warped seasonally. Wall insulation was disgusting but effective. Aside from the standard mud infill, resourceful builders used some horrifying materials. Sheep's wool still clinging to cured hides, moss mixed with pig blood as a binding agent, pounded tree bark layered like plywood, old clothing scraps pulped into a fibrous paste. Archaeologists find walls containing everything from fish bones to broken pottery. Anything dense enough to block drafts. Chimneys, when they existed, were fire hazards. Early chimneys were just holes with sticks arranged in a lattice that quickly became coated in flammable creosote. Smoke chambers needed constant scraping with long poles to prevent chimney fires. Many peasants preferred the older system of smoke holes because while they filled the house with fumes, at least they rarely burned the place down. Storage solutions were precarious. Food had to be kept away from both freezing temperatures and hungry animals without the benefit of sealed containers. Meat hung from ceilings where it swayed in smoke currents. Grain sacks were suspended on ropes out of rodent reach until mice learned to tightrope walk the lines. Some households dug cellar pits that inevitably flooded each spring, forcing creative solutions like floating shelves made from repurposed barrels. Homes literally moved with the seasons. Winter frost heave lifted entire cottages several inches before settling unevenly in spring. Doorways that aligned perfectly in August became impassable by January. Their agriculture laughed at drought conditions. While Europeans starved when rains failed, Keral's farmers bred drought-resistant crops like sweet potatoes and akira. They terraced hillsides to prevent erosion and practiced crop rotations centuries before it caught on elsewhere. Analysis of their stored food shows sophisticated understanding of preservation. Some pits kept potatoes edible for over a year using ventilation channels. The biggest shock? No weapons. Excavations revealed no fortifications, no mass graves from battles, no trophy skulls. Their art depicts musicians, not warriors. Defensive structures are conspicuously absent, despite contemporaneous cultures constantly warring. Somehow, these people flourished for a millennium, without medieval Europe's constant feudal squabbles over resources. Social structure was equally progressive. Skeletons show no signs of malnutrition or extreme class disparities. Unlike Europe's bone-deep markers of peasant hardship, Keral's remains suggest shared burdens and benefits. Their largest structures weren't palaces but communal spaces suggesting collective priorities over warlord ego. They even cracked behavioral economics. Archaeologists found evidence of festive labor systems where communities voluntarily gathered for construction projects, possibly incentivized by music and psychedelics. Compare that to medieval corvée labor where serfs worked under threat of violence. Keral's murals show processions with flutes and drums, not whips and chains. Climate adaptation was proactive rather than reactive. They abandoned settlements before El Niño patterns shifted, resettling where resources remained stable. Medieval villages stubbornly clung to failing locations until starvation forced migration. Keral's planners apparently understood climate cycles well enough to anticipate rather than suffer through changes. Their textile technology rivaled modern outdoor gear. While Europeans layered grimy wool, Keral weavers produced fishnet-style fabrics combining cotton and reed fibers that breathed in heat yet trapped warmth at night. Some recovered garments showed deliberate spacing of knots to regulate insulation, anticipating thermal clothing tech by 2,500 years. Architectural acoustics reveal sophistication medieval churches couldn't match. Keral's sunken circular plazas amplify sound so precisely that a whisper at one end can be heard clearly at the other. The design simultaneously prevents echoes, perfect for public announcements, without medieval-style shouting matches. Their collapse wasn't from incompetence, but success. Evidence suggests over-irrigation eventually salinized their soil, a problem of abundance rather than scarcity. Even in decline, they avoided medieval-style apocalyptic scenarios. Neighboring cultures adopted rather than conquered their innovations when Carol's people dispersed. The contrast with medieval Europe couldn't be starker. While peasants shivered in filth, Carol's citizens bathed regularly in engineered pools. Where European villages smelled of dung and decay, Peruvian excavations show aromatic plants lining walkways. Both faced extreme climates, one merely survived while the other thrived. Perhaps most telling are the children's toys. European medieval sites yield little evidence of playthings beyond sticks and bones. Corral's ruins reveal meticulously crafted dolls, miniature houses, and game pieces, signs of a society with surplus energy for childhood, not just grinding survival. This wasn't primitive utopia, they had problems, but their solutions made medieval Europe's look barbaric by comparison. No wonder modern Peruvian builders still study Carol's techniques for earthquake resilience. While Gothic architects obsessed over verticality and intimidation, these desert dwellers' cracked codes of sustainable living were still struggling to relearn. Their legacy haunts modern survival narratives. If a Bronze Age civilization could prosper in harsher conditions than medieval Europe with zero metal tools, why did the supposedly advanced West struggle so brutally? The answer probably lies in social priorities rather than technology. Carol invested in communal welfare, feudal Europe in hierarchical control. Back across the Atlantic, European nobles were busy creating different kinds of survival challenges. Anne Boleyn's imprisonment in the Tower of London during the winter of 1536 proves royalty didn't escape seasonal suffering, they just traded peasant hardships for political ones. While commoners froze in hovels, the Queen of England shivered in a stone cell where breath fogged the air even in May. The tower's luxurious reputation ignores how its riverfront location created dampness that rotted tapestries and rusted armor within weeks. Anne's rooms likely had mold blooming in tapestry folds and rushes that never fully dried between placements. Historical accounts mention Henry VIII sending coals for her fireplace, not kindness, but calculated cruelty. The K. I knew proper heating required constant tending Anne couldn't perform alone. Her ladies-in-waiting were reduced to amateur chimney sweeps, struggling with flues designed for servants' labor. Windows were nailed shut for security, creating stagnant air that amplified the cold. Unlike peasant homes where smoke escaped through gaps, Anne's chambers trapped fumes at breathable height. Food arrived cold from distant kitchens, congealing into unappetizing lumps during the quarter-mile trek through icy courtyards. Court documents show her meals included perishable delicacies like strawberries, a psychological torment when winter rations sustained the poor. Even royal prisoners followed seasonal eating patterns. Anne's final breakfast featured winter-stored apples so shriveled they resembled the hands of her aging husband. Clothing became a liability. Fashionable French hoods offered no protection against drafts slicing through arrow slits. Stiff brocade gowns retained dampness from laundresses rinsing them in Thames water. Anne famously complained her fur-lined sleeves smelled of mildew, probably because Tower storerooms bred mold on anything organic. Meanwhile, her executioner practiced outside in sensible woolens that actually retained heat. The timing of Henry's moves followed weather patterns. He imprisoned Anne as winter eased, when thawing roads allowed swift messenger travel to spread news. Her trial coincided with spring planting season, calculated distraction for a populace needing to focus on survival. The execution itself occurred on May 19th, warm enough for crowds but before summer's disease season made public spectacles risky. Anne's desperate letters reveal Cold's psychological toll. She begged for extra candles not for light, but because dripping wax helped seal drafts around windows. One note mentions listening to celebrations in warm palace chambers, while her fingers turned blue stitching burial shrouds for herself. Tower guards reported her pacing not from anxiety, but to maintain circulation in a cell where temperatures hovered just above freezing. Royal survival strategies differed starkly from peasant methods. Where villagers huddled together, noble prisoners were isolated to prevent conspiracy. Peasants burned furniture recklessly, while Anne rationed her meager coal allotment, knowing guards pocketed most of it. Commoners shared lice for warmth. Anne's ladies picked vermin from her hair in a nightly ritual that became increasingly futile. The tower's architecture magnified winter misery. Its thick walls stored cold like a freezer, ensuring summer heat never fully dissipated before winter returned. Anne's walking path in the Beauchamp Tower still shows uneven wear from prisoners shuffling to avoid icy patches. Modern thermography reveals cold spots matching where witnesses reported seeing her ghost-likely areas where drafts concentrated most brutally. Spring's arrival brought no relief. The thaw made the tower's moat release, months of accumulated sewage smells. Anne's execution morning dawned unusually chilly, requiring the axeman to blow on his hands between practice swings. Her final walk past puddles of half-melted frost nature's confirmation that winter's cruelty outlasted Henry's. Political winters followed literal ones. Anne's downfall began months earlier at a Christmas tournament where Henry first publicly snubbed her. February's Privy Council meetings occurred in unheated chambers, where members' discomfort shortened debates in Henry's favor. Even her replacement, Jane Seymour, caught ill during a winter progress meant to showcase the king's virility amidst seasonal depression. Wealth couldn't conquer physics. Anne's six-fingered glove, historical myth though it may be, symbolizes nobility's futile attempts to armor against elements. The execution block itself had to be brought indoors the night prior not for secrecy, but to prevent metal from becoming too cold for clean strikes. Her famed portrait medallion shows cheeks rosy from perpetual chill rather than romantic blush. Modern tourists, complaining about the tower's lack of central heating, fail to grasp the point. Anne's suffering wasn't incidental, it was policy. Royal prisoners received just enough fuel to prolong misery without providing comfort. Accounts list bribes paid to guards for extra blankets at prices that would feed peasant families for months. The real prison wasn't the tower's stones, but the knowledge warmer rooms existed yards away, occupied by those preferring your death. Anne's final winter wasn't weather-related. Her political winter began when Henry's passion cooled faster than a January stream. The execution timing reinforced this metaphor. Killing a queen, as nature revived, suggested her reign had been an unnatural season itself. Across the Atlantic, a different winter was brewing that would tie royal oppression to seasonal suffering in colonists' minds. The Boston Tea Party didn't happen in some pleasant... Chaucer's pilgrims complained about uncomfortable inns, not about how overnight stays often involved 20 strangers farting rotten fish breath under shared blankets. Modern readers imagine knights riding through snow like Christmas cards, not suffering testicular frostbite from metal armor conducting cold directly to the groin. The wellness industry co-ops medieval suffering. Sauna enthusiasts brag about traditional heat therapy while ignoring smoke inhalation injuries from actual medieval sweathouses. Herbal remedy shops sell ancient cold cures that skip the part where original preparations included spit and earwax for texture. Yoga instructors teach medieval breathing techniques, but omit how peasants developed them to avoid literally freezing their lungs. Archaeology reveals uncomfortable truths. Analysis of medieval latrine pits shows 40% of samples contain parasite eggs from night soil, used as fertilizer, a detail absent from farm life recreations. Dental calculus on skeletons proves people chewed raw wheat grains to soften them, wearing teeth down to nerves. Museum displays clean up coprolites, fossilized feces, that prove workers ate plaster when starving their bones, retained telltale mineral signatures. Historical cooking shows perpetuate myths. TV chefs bake peasant bread in temperature-controlled ovens, instead of recreating the carcinogenic smoke flavors from open hearths. Recipes call for a pinch of salt, when accurate portions would require teaspoons of grit and insect parts. Even meticulous recreations fail. Modern wheat lacks the ergot fungus that caused mass hallucinations during particularly grim harvests. The plague gets cute makeovers. Halloween costumes feature playful doctor masks, missing the urine-soaked leather filtration layers. Plague dioramas show tidy plague doctors, but not relatives smashing skulls to release demons during encephalitis outbreaks. Museums display jewelry from the period without noting many pieces were worn to hold vinegar sponges against the nose, against corpse stench. Modern medievalism reflects our needs, not theirs. Viking TV dramas emphasize warrior culture because office workers crave power fantasies, not the historical reality where most Norsemen died shoveling manure onto frozen fields. Castle restorements install picturesque arrow slits while filling in the original murder holes that once poured boiling waste onto invaders. We've rebuilt the Middle Ages as a mirror to flatter ourselves. The greatest distortion? Pretending medieval people accepted their suffering. Diaries and legal records prove they hated the cold just like we would. Peasants brought lawsuits over stolen firewood, poets cursed icy drafts, doctors recorded patients begging for amputations to escape frostbitten limbs. Our nostalgia turns their desperation into aesthetic preference, as if choosing scratchy wool over fleece. Every modern luxury creates distance. Antibiotics mean we don't see teeth abscesses bursting during winter famines. Synthetic fibers prevent us from understanding how lice move through wool like cities of tunnels. Even historians struggle reading about starvation winters in heated offices with protein bars in their pockets. Our bodies literally can't comprehend malnutrition-induced hypothermia while digesting breakfast smoothies. The ultimate irony? Today's extreme sports enthusiasts get closer to medieval life than reenactors do. Ultramarathoners experience the toenail loss medieval messengers suffered. Antarctic researchers understand the all-consuming focus on warmth maintenance. Homeless populations face similar frostbite risks, except medieval peasants lacked access to emergency room bailouts. We don't want real history. We want the Middle Ages as a consensual hallucination where discomfort is optional and suffering is scenic. The fantasy says more about our fragility than their resilience. Wrap that in faux velvet and sell it with turkey legs if you want, but stop calling it accurate. Those who actually endured winters left messages in bone deformities and burial patterns. Their truth was written in frostbite scars, not Instagram captions. That thermostat you adjusted without thinking? It's a miracle. Your medieval ancestors would have burned witches to obtain. Consistent indoor heat has only been common for about 3 generations, a blink in human history. Your great-grandparents might have slept in unheated bedrooms, but go back one more generation and you'll find families huddling around stoves they feared might kill them by morning. We've built a civilization that assumes 68 to 4F is a human right, while millions still live like it's 1,385. Energy poverty affects over 1 billion people today. That's more than the entire medieval European population. Families in Siberia's coldest regions pay 60% of their income just to avoid freezing, while others burn trash for warmth. Modern heating isn't universal. It's a lottery most of history lost. Your power grid is more fragile than you think. Texas's 2021 winter outage killed 246 people, comparable to a bad medieval famine season. Rolling blackouts in developed nations prove we're not immune to collapse. Those backup generators in hospitals? Medieval monasteries had similar vulnerabilities when their wood stores ran low. The main difference is scale, not substance. The comfort gap distorts history. You read about medieval peasants and imagine they somehow got used to the cold. But skeletal evidence shows chronic frostbite damage in 90% of adult remains. Frostnip scars on cheekbones, toes fused from repeated freezing. These weren't people who adapted, they were victims of conditions we'd now call torture. Modern heating changed human biology. Your body no longer stockpiles brown fat for winter like your ancestors did. Your nose doesn't enlarge seasonally to warm incoming air. Even your sleep patterns have shifted. Medieval people woke frequently to tend fires, while your uninterrupted sleep depends on a furnace humming somewhere in your home. Energy abundance rewired society. Dating apps thrive because people can lounge comfortably alone instead of marriage being a survival pact. The 7-hour workweek presupposes you're not spending 4 hours daily collecting fuel. Netflix binges exist because your body isn't diverting all calories to heat production. None of this is normal by historical standards. We've forgotten simple survival math. Medieval peasants understood that staying alive in winter required burning 50 joule calories daily just to maintain body heat double summer needs. Your smart thermostat adjusts without you realizing your metabolism no longer flexes with seasons. Those extra holiday pounds your doctor warns about, they'd have been your ancestors' winter insurance policy. The elderly suffered most then and still do now. Britain's excess winter deaths still average 25.0 annually, mostly among pensioners choosing between heating and food. Medieval almshouses at least recognized the crisis, while today we pretend central heating solved everything. The vulnerability never disappeared, we just got better at ignoring it. Your clothes are a thermal lie. That winter coat in your closet would have killed a medieval peasant caught in a snowstorm. Modern fabrics create the illusion that environments are milder than they are. Tests show someone dressed in accurate medieval garb with modern heating survives better than someone in high-tech gear without it, because infrastructure matters more than apparel. Survival strategies linger in odd places. Your grandmother's obsession with knitted blankets, genetic memory of bed curtains that trapped breath warmth, the Scandinavian concept of hygge, a cultural scar from centuries when coziness meant survival. Even your childhood habit of sticking feet under siblings at night echoes peasant heat-sharing tactics. Energy inequality mirrors feudal divides. Medieval nobles wore fur-lined robes. Today's wealthy install radiant floor heating. Then as now, the poor innovate like Ukrainian babushkas sewing window insulation from plastic bottles, or homeless veterans lining sleeping bags with pizza delivery bags. Thermal hierarchy outlasted kings and castles. Ancient solutions are making comebacks. Passive house builders now use straw bale insulation, medieval wattle and daub's high-tech cousin. Norwegian engineers study Viking longhouse designs for geothermal efficiency. Even the heated chair trend replicates monastic designs where warm air from lower floors rose through seating. The real privilege isn't wealth, it's ignorance. You can binge-watch medieval dramas without your fingertips aching from cold. You sleep through nights that would have left ancestors coughing from smoke inhalation. Your biggest winter worry is whether your latte is hot enough, not whether your children will wake up hypothermic. This illusion could shatter fast. One extended grid failure would send millions relearning medieval survival rules within days. Urban populations lack even basic cold literacy. Would you know which walls to insulate first? How to layer wet wool for warmth? Which household items burn longest? Our knowledge gap is mortal danger in waiting. Warmth isn't just comfort, it's accumulated technological advantage. That furnace in your basement represents centuries of fuel science, metallurgy, and energy infrastructure. The shift from open hearths to central heating did more to extend lifespan than most medical advances. Your thermostat isn't an appliance. It's the pinnacle of human ingenuity disguised as a dial. Winter mortality never truly disappeared. It just changed forms: elderly falling on icy sidewalks instead of starving in frozen fields. Carbon monoxide poisoning from space heaters instead of smoke inhalation. Homelessness deaths rather than failed harvests. The cold finds vulnerabilities no matter the century. Medieval peasants would weep to see you yawn while adjusting your smart thermostat D. Onward, because you're slightly too warm. Their entire existence was dedicated to achieving what you casually discard. That unappreciated luxury is the invisible foundation of modern life, the warmth that lets you focus on anything beyond mere survival. We like to talk about medieval resilience like it was some noble trait. But starvation does funny things to morals. Those charming peasant villages you see in storybooks? During the worst winters, they turned into survival labs where ethics froze faster than the rivers. Church records from the Great Famine describe the silent hunger, not because people weren't starving, but because neighbors stopped speaking to avoid sharing food. Archaeological dice reveal uncomfortable truths. Some mass graves show bones with precise butcher marks, not from animals, but from careful human processing. Frozen lakes preserved bodies with stomach contents containing things no one would eat by choice. One 14th century burial pit in England contained a family group where the youngest showed signs of being killed cleanly before the others died more slowly. Legal documents tell darker stories. Manorial courts heard cases of night grazing, where tenants sneaked into neighbors' pastures to chew bark off living trees. Some peasants were fined for stealing handfuls of grain from bird feeders. The worst offenses never made it to court, like the countless cases of abandoned elders accidentally left outside during snowstorms. Winter reshaped family bonds. Records from particularly brutal years show suspicious jumps in stillbirths right before famines peaked. Wet nurses suddenly became scarce when food ran low. The phrase, "gave their share to the children," appears too consistently in some village death records to be coincidence. Genetic studies suggest some populations still carry markers of extreme selective pressure from these events. The wealthy weren't exempt. Noble houses kept meticulous accounts of which servants got fed during shortages. Pages as young as 8 were sent into blizzards to hunt non-existent game rather than consume stored provisions. One baron's diary describes boiling his favorite hunting dogs for broth while pretending they'd run away, an act that required weeks of preparation to avoid social shame. Morality became seasonal. Summer might see villagers sharing plows and helping with harvests. Come winter, the same people would hide grain in coffins or poison stray dogs to preserve scraps. Church courts struggled with cases where theft victims refused to prosecute because they'd committed worse themselves. Some priests recorded instances of whole villages taking simultaneous false oaths about missing food stores. Psychological strategies developed around the guilt. Folklore is full of stories about hunger ghosts who demanded food, possibly projections of survivors' consciences. Regional dialects developed euphemisms like winter sleep for starvation deaths. Even the famous medieval mystery plays contained coded references to famine choices, with Cain and Abel stories taking on special resonance. The animal kingdom suffered too. Normally revered hunting hounds disappeared first when hunger struck. Stable records show horses fed on thatch and leather when oats ran out. Some monasteries kept detailed accounts of which relics tasted best when boiled. St. Blandina's shin bone reportedly made passable broth when flavored with pine needles. Children learned harsh lessons early. Nursery rhymes warned against trusting even close kin when food grew scarce. Games like Hide the Loaf taught kids to cache personal reserves. Some initiation rituals involved controlled starvation to prepare youths for inevitable hardship. Skeletal remains show teenage growth spurts stunted exactly when local records note bad harvests. The church struggled to maintain order. Some bishops quietly relaxed fasting rules during famines, knowing full well peasants would starve themselves rather than risk damnation. Confession manuals included specific questions about food-related sins that wouldn't be out of place in survival horror games. Tithe records show suspicious dips in grain offerings exactly when private hoarding would have peaked. Modern reconstructions miss the mental toll. Reenactors can quit anytime they want. Actual peasants had no exit strategy. Living history museums glow with cheerful firelight, but omit how months of smoke inhalation caused permanent brain fog. Those romantic candlelit feasts in films ignore how constant calorie stress made people hallucinate even before ergot poisoning set in. The survivor's dilemma never changed. At what point does sharing become suicide? When does a parent's sacrifice cross into murder? How many could watch children starve before considering the unthinkable? We judge from our climate-controlled homes, but winter stripped away those comforts long before it took lives. Artifacts tell the real stories. That beautiful tapestry might hide bloodstains from fights over scraps. The lovingly carved crib could have been repurposed as a coffin. Even saints' relics sometimes doubled as emergency ration containers. One surviving reliquary was found stuffed with moldy grains behind the actual bone fragments. The lesson isn't about medieval cruelty. It's about how thin the veneer of civilization becomes when frostbite sets in. Modern emergency planners study these events not to judge ancestors, but to prepare for futures where comfort might vanish again. Those dark age choices look different when your own cupboards approach empty. Our advantage isn't morality, it's surplus. Your ancestors weren't better or worse people. They just lived where one bad season meant choosing who got to see spring. The real medieval legacy isn't in castles or cathedrals, but in the genetic memory of starvation that still shapes our eating habits today. The ultimate survival skill wasn't strength or cleverness. It was the ability to look your neighbor in the eye after winter took their child but spared yours. That's a cost no amount of romantic nostalgia can cover. Which brings us to today's lessons. The medieval winter wasn't some quaint seasonal backdrop, it was a yearly fight for survival that reshaped bodies and minds. Those peasants weren't just cold, they lived in perpetual adaptation to an environment actively trying to kill them. We've lost the muscle memory of that struggle, the ingrained terror of a dying fire at midnight. Our comfort comes from forgetting their brutal reality. Those picture-perfect thatched cottages? Triumphs of desperation, not charm. Every winter survival tactic was written in scars and lost children. Their truth lies in bones with frost cracks, not storybook illusions. So next time your heater kicks on automatically, remember that's more miraculous than any medieval relic. Our warmth isn't normal by historical standards. Those ancestors clawed through winters so we wouldn't have to. The least we can do is acknowledge their suffering wasn't noble, just necessary brutal work to buy our comfort today. Now go check your thermostat and be thankful it exists.